Well, here with me to talk through what's happening in Ukraine is the retired Air Vice-Marshal Sean Bell. And Sean, let's talk about Bakhmut. An awful lot of fighting going on there, a lot of focus on this town. Why are the Russians putting so much into this particular town, do you think?
Yeah, it's a great question because the Russians are clearly focused on taking the whole of the Donetsk region, but Bakhmut is a relatively insignificant town from a military perspective, yet the Russians seem to be expending an awful lot of effort to take it. Part of the answer lies in the fact that the Wagner group, the mercenary group, are the lead for that operation in that area. There's about 50,000 troops, 10,000 of their sort of contractors, 40,000 convicts there. They've also not short of arms because they've just had an assignment of arms from North Korea, probably artillery shells. But despite all this men and material, they're still making very slow progress and huge casualties. Part of the reason behind that appears to be that the guy who's founded the Wagner group, Prigozhin, is very keen to demonstrate that his group can actually do things on the battlefield that the serving Russian army cannot. Prigozhin has got his own political ambitions, and he seems to be quite prepared to sacrifice tens of thousands of men in the pursuit of that ambition. On a slightly lighter note, Admiral Kuznetsov, which is the Russian aircraft carrier, it's the only one they've got, that went in to have some work done about 5 years ago. But in 2018, the dry dock that it was mounted in, which is the biggest Russia has, sank. And a 70-ton crane that was on that collapsed onto the flight deck of the aircraft carrier, made a 200-odd square foot hole in the flight deck. Ever since then, it's been under repair. It was within weeks of being returned to the Russian Navy to be able to be their flagship again. But we heard the other day it caught fire. And we're not quite sure the extent of the damage, but it looks quite significant. No suggestion at this stage it's anything to do with the Ukrainians at all. But it's a really good example of the woes facing the Russian military at the moment.
Indeed. And meanwhile, we've seen President Zelensky this week in Washington, meeting President Biden. What has that visit achieved, and what's it highlighted about the approach that the US is taking as opposed to the EU?
Yeah, I mean, clearly, President Zelensky is utterly reliant on the flow of weapons and money from the West, and the alliance of the West is really critical. Zelensky went there for a whole bundle of reasons, but actually he needs more weapons. At the start of this conflict, Ukraine was on the defensive, so they needed short-range weapons, anti-tank weapons, that sort of thing. Once they turned the tide and they started getting on the offence, they needed longer-range weapons, so the Americans provided HIMARS, a 50-mile range, so they could target behind the enemy lines. Now, as Ukraine wants to seize the initiative and actually gain a bit more momentum, America's look to offer their ATACMS missile, which is a 200-mile range missile. The challenge of that, of course, is that there are some EU leaders that are really paranoid about how that will get used, because the danger is it could get used to target Russian military facilities, excuse me, actually in Russia itself. And, of course, that risks a grave escalation of the conflict, because if Putin alleges that Russia is under attack, the grave risk of an escalation, there's no doubt there'll be a lot of intensive diplomatic conversations going on behind the scenes at the moment.
Yeah, and meanwhile, we've seen the cosy fireside scenes there between President Zelensky and President Biden. How's that been viewed in Russia? Has there been any response from President Putin?
Yes, I mean, initially, President Putin was very dismissive about the Patriot missiles being launched. But of course, he called it a provocation. But the reality is that these Patriots are defensive missiles. They're designed to take out ballistic missiles, which Russia was using to target civilian population. But now Putin's actually come out and alluded to the fact that these missiles might not just be defensive, they may have an offensive, and also that the Ukrainians and the US are extending this war. The reality is that a lot of that's for a domestic audience. We're not closing in on a deal anytime soon.
OK, Sean Bell, thanks very much indeed.